I'm Emily Parker. I'm 32 years old. I'm a graphic designer in Denver, Colorado. And this morning, I woke up to 29 missed calls from a number in Illinois. I stared at my phone for so long that my coffee went cold in my hand. Because deep down, before I even listened to a single voicemail, I already knew who it had to be. Some memories don't fade with time. They wait. They sit quietly in the dark corners of your life until one ordinary morning. They rise up and drag you all the way back. For me, it was one sound, one number, one flashing screen, and suddenly, I was 12 years old again, standing alone or inside Union Station in Chicago, watching the only people who were supposed to protect me turn my fear into entertainment. My mother left me at a train station as a joke. They laughed. They actually made a bet over whether I could find my way home on my own. I can still remember the way my stomach dropped when I realized they weren't coming back for me. The way every face in that station looked unfamiliar. The way the whole city felt too big, too loud, and too cold for a little girl with almost no money in her pocket. That was the day my life split into two versions. The girl I had been before that moment, and the person I had to become afterward. I never went back. Not that night, not the next week, not ever. I built a different life, a different future, and put as much distance between myself and them as possible. Most days. I could almost convince myself they no longer existed. But this morning, those 29 missed calls proved something I had spent 20 years trying to bury. The past doesn't always stay where you leave it. Sometimes, it comes looking for you. Growing up in Willow Creek, Illinois, taught me very early that appearances meant everything in my family. To our neighbors, we looked solid and respectable. The kind of middle-class American family people pointed to when they wanted to talk about hard work and good values. My parents owned a small but successful chain of home goods stores, the kind of places that sold kitchen mixers, bedding, discount coffee makers, and every random household item people didn't know they needed until they walked past a bright display. On weekends, my father grilled in the backyard. My mother waved at people across the fence. From the outside, we looked like a family other people might admire. But inside the house, love was always tied to performance, and safety depended on whether my mother was bored enough to invent another lesson. She loved calling them lessons. That was her favorite word. If I cried, I was too sensitive. If I asked for help, I was helpless. If I forgot something, I needed to learn responsibility. She could turn any normal childhood mistake into a reason to humiliate me. And my father always backed her up with a grin, as if cruelty were some kind of team sport they both enjoyed. When I was 8 years old, I asked for a pair of sneakers at the mall because my old ones were falling apart at the toes. My mother told me I was acting spoiled. She marched me to a bench near the food court and said that if I wanted to live in the real world, I could start by learning that nobody owed me anything. Then they left me there for almost 3 hours. I remember staring at a pretzel stand, smelling cinnamon and butter, trying not to cry, because every time I cried, it seemed to entertain them. When they finally came back, my father laughed and asked my mother if she owed him $20 because he had guessed I would still be sitting in the same spot. When I was 10, I cried after a youth football game because a group of boys from school mocked me in the parking lot. Instead of comforting me, My parents drove to the far side of the stadium lot. They told me to get out of the car. Then they left me there after sunset, according to my mother. Tears made people weak, and weakness attracted worse treatment. I sat on a concrete curb with my arms wrapped around my knees, watching trucks pull out one by one nearly an hour later. They returned with fast food for themselves. There was no apology. My father thought it was hilarious that I was still there. He said he had bet I would try to hitch a ride home or beg strangers for help. That was the pattern. Everything became a test. Everything became a joke at my expense. Everything became another way for them to prove that the world was hard, as if I needed them to make it even harder. The strangest part was that they never thought of themselves as cruel. They talked about character, about grit, about preparing me for reality. They used big words to make ugly things sound noble. If anyone had asked them, they would have said they were raising an independent daughter. But independence wasn't what they were building. Fear was. Hypervigilance was. Silence was. I learned to study their moods before speaking. I learned how to disappear inside my own home. I learned that if I stayed quiet enough, useful enough, invisible enough, maybe I could get through a day without becoming the target of one of their experiments. The only place I ever felt like I existed outside their rules was on paper. I drew constantly. I drew on the backs of receipts, in the margins of school assignments, on cheap sketch pads I bought with babysitting money. I drew bedrooms with locked doors, train windows full of light, women standing on mountaintops with nobody behind them. At 12 years old, I couldn't have explained any of that, but now I know I was trying to draw my way out of my own life. What pushed everything over the edge was something so small that most parents wouldn't even remember it a week later. I got a B+ in art, not math, not science. Art, the one subject that made me feel alive. I was proud of it. Until I walked through the front door and saw my mother holding the report card, as if it were evidence of some moral failure. She asked how a girl who spent so much time drawing could still manage to disappoint her in the one class she supposedly cared about. My father said maybe I was getting lazy. My mother said maybe I had started thinking effort was enough. That night, while I sat in my room pretending to do homework, I heard them talking in the kitchen. Their voices were low and amused, the kind of tone that always made my stomach tighten. My mother said I needed a lesson I would never forget. My father said he would bet money on that. The next morning, they acted so cheerful that it made my skin crawl. My mother made pancakes. My father actually asked if I wanted orange juice. They told me we were taking a day trip into Chicago. Just the three of us. And for one stupid, desperate second, I thought maybe they were trying to fix something. Maybe they had cooled off. Maybe the argument over the report card was over. Maybe this was the closest thing my family could manage to an apology. I should have known better. The whole drive from Willow Creek to the city felt wrong. My father kept the radio loud and drummed on the steering wheel like he was in a fantastic mood. My mother kept turning around from the passenger seat to ask questions she already knew I would answer carefully. Did I think I was smart? Did I think smart girls were ready for the real world? Did I think life would care whether I was scared? Every answer I gave seemed to amuse them every time I tried to stay quiet. They pushed harder. By the time the Chicago skyline came into view, I had that familiar feeling in my chest, the feeling that something bad was coming, and that I wouldn't be allowed to prepare for it. We parked near Union Station around noon. I had never seen anything that big or that crowded up close. The station felt like an entire city compressed under one roof. People with rolling suitcases hurried past in every direction. Businessmen, families, tourists, college students, all of them moving as if they belonged there. I stayed close to my parents because I didn't know where else to stand, inside the main hall. My mother pointed to a massive pillar near the entrance. She told me to wait there while they moved the car and grabbed lunch. 15 minutes, she said, maybe 20. I asked if I could go with them, and my father laughed so loudly that people turned to look. He said I was 12, not 2. My mother leaned closer and told me not to embarrass her in public. So I nodded and stayed by the pillar while they walked away. I remember checking the giant station clock over and over again. 15 minutes passed, then 30, then 45. At first, I told myself parking was bad. Maybe the food line was long. Maybe they had gotten turned around. An hour later, my chest started to hurt. After an hour and a half, panic was rising so fast that my hands began to shake. I had $9 in my pocket, no phone, no address written down, no idea how the trains worked. I had never felt smaller in my life. I would walk a few feet away from the pillar, then rush back because they had told me not to move. And even then, part of me was still terrified of doing the wrong thing. The station grew louder as the afternoon dragged on. Every announcement over the speakers made my heart jump. Every woman with dark hair made me turn my head. Every second stretched until it felt cruel. Then I saw the car through the front windows. I watched our car move slowly down the street outside. Relief hit me so hard I almost laughed. I ran toward the glass, waving both arms. For a split second, I truly believed they had come back. My father was driving. My mother sat in the passenger seat. Both of them were looking directly at me. My father smiled first, not the relieved smile of someone who had found a lost child, the smile of someone watching a punchline land exactly the way he hoped it would. My mother rolled down her window and leaned out just enough for me to hear her over the traffic. I bet $50 you can't even find your way home. Then she laughed. My father laughed with her. He lifted one hand from the steering wheel and gave a stupid little thumbs up, like they were congratulating themselves for being clever. Then the car rolled away and disappeared into traffic. That was the moment the world changed shape for me. It was one thing to fear they had forgotten me. It was one thing to suspect they were teaching me another lesson. It was something else entirely to see them choose it, to watch them enjoy it, to realize that my fear wasn't a side effect of what they were doing. It was the point. I stood frozen until someone brushed past me and muttered, "Excuse me." The sound of a stranger's voice snapped me back into my body. I ran back inside because I didn't know what else to do. I wandered from one end of the station to the other. I cried off and on, every few minutes. I wiped my face because I was still embarrassed to be seen upset. My parents had trained that into me. 2. I tried to think of someone I could call. There was no one. I tried to picture the route home. But home might as well have been another country. I sat on a bench, then stood up again. then walked in circles until my legs hurt. At some point, I stopped expecting them to come back. At some point, the waiting ended and the abandonment began. That difference may sound small, but when you're 12 years old, it feels like falling through ice. I spent almost 3 hours inside Union Station after they left me there. Long enough for the light outside to begin changing. Long enough for the crowds to thin and fill again. Long enough that I stopped thinking in complete sentences and started moving on instinct alone. I stayed away from the doors because I was afraid of stepping into the city and getting even more lost. I stayed away from the police because my parents had always told me that if I caused trouble, authority figures would make everything worse. I stayed away from strangers because those same people who abandoned me had spent years teaching me that asking for help was weakness. Looking back, I think that was one of the cruelest parts of what they did. They trained me not to trust anyone. Then they left me in a place where trust was the only thing that could have helped me quickly. The person who finally noticed me was a station employee named Maria. She was in her 50s, with tired eyes and the kind of calm voice that made you want to tell the truth even when you were scared. Apparently, she had seen me pass the same row of seats and vending machines several times. She stopped me near a hallway leading to the administrative offices and asked if I was lost. I lied immediately. I said I was waiting for my parents. She asked how long I had been waiting. I said I didn't know. Then she asked if I had eaten. That was the question that broke me. I started crying so hard I could barely breathe. All the shame I had been swallowing since noon came apart in one ugly rush. I told her they had left me. I told her they had driven past the station and laughed. I told her my mother had bet money on whether I could find my way home. Maria didn't react the way my parents would have. She didn't tell me to calm down. She didn't accuse me of being dramatic. She crouched slightly so her face was level with mine, and said very clearly, "You are safe right now, and I am going to help you." Security was called first, then transit police. One officer took my statement while another reviewed the station cameras covering the front entrance. They confirmed that I had been standing there for a long time. They also confirmed that a car matching my description had slowed near the curb outside before driving away. That detail mattered later. At the time, all I knew was that the adults around me had suddenly become very serious. One officer asked for my parents' names, our home address, the store name, everything I could remember. Another officer brought me water and crackers because I hadn't eaten since breakfast. When they finally reached my parents by phone, I could hear only half of the conversation, but I'll never forget the expression on the officer's face. It went from cautious professionalism to open disbelief in less than 10 seconds. He asked whether they were returning to Chicago immediately. Then he went silent. He listened for a long moment before saying, "No, ma'am. Leaving a 12-year-old child in a major transit station is not a lesson in independence. It's child abandonment." My whole body went cold when I heard those words. Not because they sounded too harsh, because they fit. By early evening, I was sitting in a small interview room with a social worker while a report was prepared. She explained that because my parents were refusing to return right away, and were still insisting this had been a parenting decision, I couldn't simply be sent home, even if they later changed their minds. There would be an emergency placement until family court reviewed the case. I didn't understand most of the legal language, But I understood the look on her face. She believed me. More than that, she believed I hadn't been safe long before that day. I was terrified when they told me I would spend the night with a foster family. I had grown up hearing stories about what happened to children who were taken away. But then I met Mark and Laura Bennett. They weren't glamorous, and they weren't trying too hard to seem perfect. Mark was a photographer with ink stains on his fingers from handling prints. Laura was a preschool teacher who smelled faintly of lotion and classroom paper. Their house was warm and cluttered in a way that felt lived in rather than chaotic. There was a lamp glowing in the entryway. Framed family photos hung on the walls. A dog bed sat in the corner, though the dog itself was asleep somewhere deeper in the house. Laura asked if I wanted spaghetti or soup. Mark asked whether I preferred the hallway light on or off when I went to bed. Nobody yelled when I said I didn't know. Nobody mocked me for crying at the dinner table after taking 2 bites and realizing I was too exhausted to pretend I was okay. That first night in their guest room, I barely slept. Every car door outside made me flinch. Every creak in the hallway made me sit upright. But even through all that fear, one thought kept circling in my mind. A stranger at a train station had shown me more kindness in 5 minutes than my own mother had shown me in years. I didn't have the language for that yet. I only knew that the world suddenly looked different. And once you discover that other people are capable of protecting you, it becomes impossible to keep calling cruelty normal. The days that followed felt like living inside someone else's life. I went from the Bennett house to meetings with social workers, then therapy evaluations, then a family court building downtown, where adults spoke in careful voices about my future as though it were both fragile and urgently important. My parents showed up with a lawyer and the exact same attitude they had always had at home: calm, offended, slightly amused that anyone was taking this so seriously. My mother wore a navy blazer and pearl earrings, as though looking respectable could erase what she had done. My father leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, acting as if the entire situation were just another inconvenience he would eventually outlast. They didn't deny leaving me at Union Station. That was the unbelievable part. They admitted it. They simply insisted it had been controlled, educational, necessary. My mother actually said they were trying to build resilience. My father said children in this country had become too soft and that somebody needed to teach them how the real world worked. I sat across from them, listening to all of this, and realized something that changed me almost as much as the train station itself. They were never going to become the kind of parents who understood what they had done. If they had been capable of that kind of honesty, they would have turned the car around before they ever reached the freeway. The court-appointed therapist's report described a pattern of emotional abuse, humiliation, neglect, and escalating endangerment. Those words weren't mine, but hearing them spoken aloud felt like oxygen entering a locked room. For years, I had convinced myself that my childhood was somehow my fault, because that was easier than believing the people responsible for me were choosing to hurt me on purpose. The report made it plain. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a strict parenting style. It was abuse dressed up in middle-class language. When the judge finally asked whether I wanted to return home while the court monitored the family, I said no, so quickly that the answer seemed to surprise even me. My mother stared at me as if I had slapped her. My father muttered something under his breath about ingratitude. The judge didn't flinch. The next phase was supposed to be a path toward reunification. Parenting classes, family therapy, supervised visits, regular reviews. A long process designed to give my parents every opportunity to prove they could change. On paper, it sounded fair. In reality, my parents treated it like a public insult. They hated being evaluated. They hated being monitored. Most of all, they hated the teachers, therapists, and court officials now had access to the private side of the family they had spent years polishing for everyone else. My father complained more about damage to the store's reputation than he did about losing custody of me. My mother kept saying she wouldn't let the state tell her how to raise her own child. Then came the most important moment in the entire case. They were given a choice. They could commit to a 2-year reunification program and complete everything the court required. Or they could voluntarily surrender their parental rights. They chose surrender. Just like that. My heart didn't break in the courtroom the way you might imagine. Instead, everything inside me went strangely still. I had spent my entire life trying to be good enough to keep them from turning on me. And in the end, they gave me up rather than admit they were wrong. That was the truth that stayed with me the longest. They didn't lose me because the system took me away. They handed me over to protect their pride. After that, things moved quickly. The Bennetts were already licensed foster parents. Over the following months, they became something else entirely. Mark started setting aside photography magazines and art books because he noticed how often I drew. Laura always knocked before entering my room. That may sound like a tiny thing, but when you grow up in a house where privacy doesn't exist, it feels enormous. They learned which foods made me anxious because of punishments tied to meals in my old home. They stopped asking me to make eye contact when I was upset. They didn't demand love. They didn't demand gratitude. They didn't demand instant trust. They simply stayed. And steadiness can feel almost supernatural to a child who has never known it. The adoption was finalized after enough time had passed for everyone to pretend the process had been orderly. But emotionally, it had already happened long before the judge signed the final paperwork. When I was asked whether I wanted to change my name, I didn't hesitate. Jennifer Caldwell belonged to a girl who had stood in a train station with $9 in her pocket and no idea whether she still mattered to her own family. Emily Bennett belonged to someone else, someone with a room of her own, a desk covered in drawing supplies, a family that didn't laugh when she was afraid. I still remember the first night after the adoption became official. Laura put fresh sheets on my bed, just as she always did on Sundays. Mark left a brand new sketchbook on my desk. Nobody made a speech about how lucky I should feel. Nobody demanded gratitude. They acted as though I had been theirs all along. That quiet certainty healed more inside me than any dramatic moment ever could. It taught me that real love doesn't test you to prove you deserve it. Real love makes room for you long before you know how to relax into it. Healing didn't happen all at once, and it definitely didn't happen in a straight line. People love stories where one act of rescue fixes everything, where the damaged child instantly blossoms the moment she's placed in a better home. My life wasn't like that. For years, my body still reacted to kindness as though it might be a trap. If Laura told me she'd be back in 15 minutes after running to the store, I had to fight the urge to watch the window until her car returned. if Mark was late picking me up from an after-school event because of traffic. Panic would build so quickly that my hands went numb. I hated waiting in public places. I hated being told to stay put. And I hated the phrase, "I'll be right back." Therapy helped, but it was slow work, the kind that forces you to say ugly truths out loud until your nervous system slowly begins to believe what your mind already knows. I learned words like trauma, emotional abuse, hypervigilance. I learned that being hurt over and over doesn't make you stronger in the way cruel people claim. It teaches you how to survive danger. It makes you excellent at survival and terrible at rest. Through all of it, the Bennetts never rushed me. They attended school events, helped with homework, remembered which subjects triggered painful memories, and respected my need for space when I closed my bedroom door. They didn't try to erase what had happened. Instead, they helped me build a life where it wasn't the only thing defining me. Art became more than an escape. It became structure, language, proof that I could create something beautiful without anyone's permission. I threw myself into it throughout high school, then into college applications, then into portfolio reviews and late-night studio sessions, after I was accepted into the Art Institute of Chicago. Moving back toward the city that had once terrified me wasn't symbolic at first. It was practical. The school was right for me. The program was strong. But somewhere during those years, I realized I was reclaiming something. The same city where I had once been abandoned became the place where I rebuilt myself. I studied graphic design, worked part-time, continued therapy, and slowly learned how to exist around people who didn't require me to shrink. After graduation, I accepted a job in Denver with a branding firm that specialized in helping small businesses develop their identities. For the first time in my life, I lived far enough away from Illinois that it felt as though geography itself was protecting me. Denver gave me space, new streets, new routines, new weather, air dry enough to clear my head. Eventually, I began taking freelance clients on the side. Then I opened my own studio. I built a reputation for clean, thoughtful visual storytelling, the kind of work that helped people communicate clearly who they were and what they stood for. Sometimes the irony almost made me laugh. My entire career grew out of the fact that I had spent my childhood trapped inside someone else's lies. I met Alex through a mutual friend at a housewarming party. He was a software engineer, patient in a way that never felt performative, remarkably difficult to rattle. On our third date, I told him I had a complicated family history. On our fifth date, I shared a little more, months later, when I finally told him about Union Station. He didn't interrupt. He didn't overreact. He didn't offer some lazy line about everything happening for a reason. He simply reached across the table, took my hand, and said, "That should never have happened to you." The simplicity of it nearly undid me. We built our relationship the same way I had rebuilt myself. Slowly, deliberately, with room for honesty. We got married in a small ceremony. Mark walked me down the aisle. Laura stood behind me, fixing the back of my dress while trying not to cry. We adopted a rescue dog named Max, a mutt with one torn ear and the cautious soul of something that had also been left behind too early. I blocked every account my biological parents ever used to contact me. Facebook, Instagram, old email addresses. I even changed my phone number after a holiday voicemail from an Illinois number, left me shaking for an hour. I didn't talk about them unless I absolutely had to. I didn't visit Willow Creek. I didn't use my old name. Most days. I could go weeks without thinking about Jennifer Caldwell at all. That was the life I had built, the life I had protected, the life I was living when those missed calls appeared on my phone. A good marriage, a studio with steady clients, morning walks with Max, dinners with friends, Sunday phone calls with Mark and Laura. A life so quiet and complete that sometimes I wondered whether peace always felt this strange to people who hadn't spent their childhood fighting for it. Then my phone lit up with 29 missed calls from Illinois, and suddenly, the ground beneath that peace shifted. There was a voicemail, then an email from an address I didn't recognize, then a message request on LinkedIn, the one platform I had kept public because of work. That was the detail that made me understand this had taken effort. Someone had been looking for me. Someone had finally connected Emily Bennett to the girl they had once laughed at through a car window. I sat at my kitchen counter with my phone in my hand while Max pressed against my leg, and Alex watched the color drain from my face. I had spent 20 years making sure the past stayed buried. Whatever was happening now had dug it up with both hands. The voicemail wasn't from my mother. It was from my younger sister, Hannah. I hadn't heard her voice since she was a little girl following me through the hallway in mismatched socks. Too young to understand why the air inside our house always felt charged. Her voice sounded older now, rougher, the way voices do when life has pressed hard against them. She told me our mother had late-stage cancer. She told me our father had suffered a mild stroke 6 months earlier. She told me the stores were gone, not struggling. Gone, one by one. They had been closed or sold at losses after the family story I thought had disappeared resurfaced in the worst possible way. A relative had posted about the train station incident in a local Facebook group. The spark came after my mother, in an astonishing act of hypocrisy, left a comment on someone else's parenting post about how children today needed stronger discipline. That single comment opened the door. Old neighbors started talking. A retired court clerk, who probably should have minded her own business but didn't, hinted that the rumors were true. Someone found an old newspaper brief mentioning a custody case connected to a child abandonment investigation. Then a former employee from one of the stores joined the conversation and described what my parents were really like behind closed doors. The image they had spent decades building collapsed quickly and publicly. Customers stopped coming. People drove to larger chain stores in neighboring towns instead. Church friends disappeared. Community organizations stopped calling. Willow Creek, which had once protected them with politeness and gossip, turned against them using those same tools. Hannah told me they were now living in a subsidized apartment outside town. No house, no stores, no reputation, no version of the old family left for them to hide inside. Then she said the sentence that explained why there had been 29 missed calls instead of one respectful message. They wanted me to come back, not because they had changed, not because time had made them honest, but because they had run out of options and were terrified of dying alone. I asked Hannah why she was calling if she knew I had every reason not to answer. There was a long silence. Then she said, "Because I wanted you to hear it from someone who isn't lying to you." She told me she had cut contact too. Not years ago, Recently, after becoming a mother herself and requesting copies of the court records to understand what had really happened when I disappeared from the family, our parents had spent years feeding her a watered-down version of the story. They told her I had overreacted, that the state had overreached, that I had been manipulated by foster parents who wanted a daughter. Hannah said reading the records felt like being hit by a truck. Afterward, she looked at her own little boy and realized she could never allow people like that near him. You might think hearing that would have felt satisfying. It didn't. It made me tired. Tired in a place deeper than anger. She asked whether I would come. I told her I would think about it. Alex told me I owed them nothing. Laura told me that whatever decision I made had to be for my peace, not their comfort. Mark said something very quietly that stayed with me. Some people only start looking for the bridge after they've burned the house down. I sat with that all night. By morning, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I wasn't going back to save them. I was going back to finish the story in my own voice. 2 days later, I flew into Chicago and drove the rest of the way to the hospital where my mother was receiving treatment. The room smelled like disinfectant and stale fear. My father looked older than I had imagined. Smaller, too, as though illness and disgrace had stripped away the performance and left only the ordinary man underneath. My mother still wore that carefully arranged expression, even while sick, as if dignity were something she could apply like lipstick. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then my mother started crying before I had even sat down. Not a quiet cry, the kind designed to pull focus. She said my name, my old name. I corrected her once, and only once. Emily. She nodded and dabbed at her eyes. Then my father said they had made mistakes. Mistakes. The same cowardly word people use when the truth is too ugly to say aloud. I told him no. A mistake is missing an exit. A mistake is forgetting milk at the grocery store. What they did was deliberate. They left a 12-year-old girl alone in a train station in a city she didn't know. They laughed while she panicked. Then they spent 20 years lying about it to protect themselves. My father started to speak, probably to explain, but I hadn't traveled all that way to listen to another defense wrapped in softer language. I told them they had turned my fear into a game, and that the reason they were sitting there now, without a business, without respect, and without either daughter beside them, was because games eventually end. People find out, children grow up, and truth catches up, even in small towns that think silence can bury anything. My mother asked whether I could forgive them. I told her forgiveness wasn't a debt I owed to people who only came looking for me after their lives fell apart. Then I said the sentence I had been carrying inside me since I was 12 years old. You bet on whether I could find my way home. I did. I just didn't come back to yours. They both cried, but for once, their tears didn't move me. I wasn't cruel, I didn't yell, I didn't insult them. And that surprised me more than anything. Because revenge, when it finally arrived, didn't feel loud, it felt cold, clear, exact. I told them I wouldn't be paying their bills. I wouldn't be managing their care, and I wouldn't be restoring contact. I told them Hannah had every right to protect her child from them. And I told them that my family existed in Colorado and Illinois, with the people who had actually earned that title. Then I stood up. My father asked if this was really goodbye. I looked at him and said, It has been goodbye for 20 years. You're just the last people to understand it. 20 minutes after I arrived, I walked out, and I never looked back. Outside, the air felt bright and thin. I stood in the parking lot with my hands shaking. Not from regret, from release. The strange release that comes when something haunting you finally takes a shape you can leave behind. On the flight home, I thought about the little girl standing alone in Union Station. The girl who believed being abandoned meant being unwanted forever. She had been wrong. She wasn't unwanted. She was unwanted by two broken people who mistook cruelty for strength. And that's not the same thing. There is a difference. Learning that difference saved my life. If there's any lesson in what happened to me, it's this. Abuse doesn't become discipline just because a parent uses cleaner words for it. Humiliation doesn't build character. Fear doesn't make children stronger. It only makes them older before their time. And walking away from people who hurt you, even when they share your blood, isn't bitterness. Sometimes it's the healthiest thing you'll ever do. I didn't leave that hospital feeling guilty. I left feeling educated by my own survival. The family you're born into may shape your wounds, but it doesn't get to define your future. Real love doesn't laugh when you're scared. Real family doesn't test whether you can survive without them. And real healing begins the moment you stop calling cruelty a lesson and start calling it what it was. Because once you do, you can build a life so honest, so steady, and so full of peace that even the people who broke you can never take it back.